Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello. Well, tomorrow President Obama, in a far tighter race than he expected, has his second debating face-off with a resurgent Mitt Romney. Both men talk a lot about the American dream and in a rather cloudy way about the founding fathers, but in this election there's been surprisingly little serious analysis of America's economic decline in the face of China, of the pinched reality for middle-class voters, of the second-rate education system and so on. So today we are going to be looking at the state of this union with the Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist Richard Ford, the novelist and commentator Lionel Shriver, the chairman of Republicans Abroad in the UK, Thomas Grant, and the FT's former Washington bureau chief, Ed Luce, whose analysis of US decline he's called Time to Start Thinking, America and the Spectre of Decline. Ed, you begin this book in a rather surprising place, perhaps, at the National Defense University outside Washington, where you have a group of rising, bright military guys who've been asked about the strategic threat to America.
Yes, and what really struck me about their attitude, I mean, the military is, a bastion of republicanism, is that they completely depart from the Republican Party orthodoxy by saying that the first thing we must do is withdraw from the world, is bring down our presence in the world, because military strength is based on economic strength. And they conduct these simulations of what the world will look like 5-10 years from now.
So these are Pentagon people, these are rising sort of Air Force, Naval, Army
These are
guys.
bright mid-career people who are going to be at the top 5-10 years from now, and they're getting sort of cognitive training.
And they're saying get out of Europe, get out of the Middle East, let China have the China Sea, because they want to slash that spending and spend it on
education, infrastructure, rebuilding the domestic economy, which is the sinew, the foundation of military power.
There is a huge argument, as you know, going on about American declinism. Is it real? Is it overstated? Are Americans taking it seriously enough? Because, there are lots of people who would argue actually America remains an extraordinarily inventive, optimistic, mobile, relatively well-educated society.
Each of those is true, but less true than it used to be. I mean, take mobile, for example. Your chances of moving up an income bracket, class mobility, are lower in the United States, not only than in Canada, Germany, but even than in Britain nowadays, which is the least mobile of the developed economies.
And you've got an astonishing statistic, I think, about the proportion of the extra money, the stimulus that Obama pushed in over the last 4 years, which has gone to the people at the very top.
Yes, I mean, and in fact, this is true of all sort of anti-poverty programs, is basically the rich get most of it. Mm-hmm. If you look at the mortgage subsidy, something like 3/4 go to the top 10%. All of them are defended in the name of the poor, but dispersed to the rich. It is quite striking how true this is of each anti-poverty program, barring the total anti-poverty ones like food stamps. Clearly, Bill Gates isn't getting food stamps. And so the public spending argument, as we face this prolonged era of fiscal austerity, is about, as you know, with Romney's 47% comment, 47% of America doesn't pay federal income tax. These are the takers as opposed to the makers, according to that perspective.
But one of the crucial arguments that you make in this book is that the makers, in the sense of manufacturing in particular, has been exported in a very, very dramatic way, and not just to China, but around the world. America doesn't make nearly as much as it used to.
No, I mean, and to get back to the Pentagon, I mean, they had a report of the 19 most critical industries for America's defense industrial preparedness. America led in all 19 in the early 1990s. It now leads in only 4 of those 19. And so that's one of the reasons why these people at the National Defense University are so panicked about America's economic strength, because the waning manufacturing strength undermines its military punch.
Richard Ford.
I was just going to chime in and say that notion about, sort of isolating ourselves to some extent is actually not so surprising, because that's kind of an old-style Republican attitude, to spend money on education, to spend money on infrastructure. That doesn't sound Republican now. It sounds... but it would have sounded Republican 25 years ago, I think. I think we were talking about Eisenhower. Before Eisenhower was invested a whole lot of money in infrastructure. It's just neoconservatism, and it's the advent of the Tea Party, really, which has made spending anathema so that you can't do that. But in terms, I mean, I'm not a Republican. I'm not a Democrat. I'm an independent. But I would say that it's a misnomer to say that those young, up-and-coming military types are going against the Republican grain, because in traditional terms they're not.
I agree. I mean, Reagan, of course, famously said, "I didn't leave the Democratic Party, the Democratic Party left me." Right. And I think this is how Pentagon high flyers feel about the Republican Party nowadays. It's left them.
And that's what most Republicans feel the same way.
Thomas Grant, as a Republican, albeit abroad, come into this debate now.
Well, turning back to the question of what one takes from the National Defense University exercise, where people were talking about the necessity to build the economy, because ultimately national defense is a function of our ability to finance the national defense and to provide the technology and the labor force to maintain a leading military in the world. But I'm not sure there's quite so much distance between what the officers you spoke to have said about the priorities in the years ahead and the Republican platform. Governor Romney's made clear that the economy is where defense starts, and his focus will be, if he has the chance to serve as president, will be to get the economy back on track. Now, that's been expressly said, that you cannot be talking about national defense in the world at large unless you've got an industrial base, a labor force, and so on. And it's not to say that the position of the officers you spoke to is absolutely on all fours with any one party's position, but I'm not sure the distance between the two is quite as great as you painted in. I mean, the book is excellent, by the way, but I'm not sure that it's quite as distant. I don't know if the positions are as far apart.
Romney has pledged, and this is a very explicit pledge, to raise defense spending to a minimum of 4% of GDP, and he's pledged to cut domestic spending relentlessly year after year. There's no actual figure there. And of course, domestic spending is R&D, it is infrastructure, it is education. So I would say, I think there is a huge gulf there.
Well, wait a minute. You talk, for example, about DARPA and the decline in DARPA spending over the last...
You better explain that.
Oh, sure. Well, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency is an entity within the Defense Department.
Advanced defense-based industrial research and innovation.
And it came up with the Internet.
Precisely.
Right? Set up by Eisenhower.
That's right, absolutely. It's the place where a lot of basic research had been done over the decades. And you're absolutely right to point out that, first of all, the overall budget of that in-house defense research program has shrunk, and it has also, to a large extent, refocused itself away from longer-term, medium-term projects on very short-term priorities. Now, there are reasons for that, but when you talk about 4% of GDP going into defense, that's not escalating beyond Cold War standards. That still would keep us below where we were at the height of the contest between the U.S. and the Soviet Union and its allies. I mean, DARPA is a component of that, and if you're looking at the necessity to build an industrial base that's first-rate and leads the world, that's one of the places where you can do that. And the 4% figure you're talking about, again, it's not a clear-cut distinction between that and the
4% is a big defense increase. It is.
Let's keep moving on a little bit, because I'm interested in this business of infrastructure and the kind of feel and the texture of America. Lionel Shriver, you live here, but you go back very, very regularly. I used to go to America and I found everything was shiny and new and exciting, and now I see potholes and rusty bridges, and you go to your hotel and you can't get Wi-Fi, and it doesn't feel quite as on the edge of the future as it used to.
Oh, not at all. In fact, there's nothing more terrifying than walking under the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway. It's completely rusted out, and it looks to me as if the repairs are being made with plywood. I mean, and you see this all over the United States. I think that for visitors, it's quite a shock. since I only go back every summer, I see the changes in juddering increments. I found Ed's book really upsetting to read, I have to say. There were times I had to put it down. Now that's a compliment.
Oh, thank you.
It's also very persuasive. That's why it's so depressing. And I think that we have to pull back from, what percentage we're spending on the military and DARPA and everything, and look at the big picture. And the big picture is that even in Republican terms, the United States is failing, and failing big time. And that is, how hard is it to get a startup established? I was amazed by
this. It could be said has all happened on Obama's watch.
Yes, it has mostly happened in the last 10 years.
Yeah,
and I was shocked that owing to new legislation in 2004, was it, that a company that has $1 million income, which is actually a small company, spends $3 million on compliance. And the whole compliance thing with regulations has become so onerous, so heavy in paperwork, and so expensive that it's not worth running a startup with an interest of going public. That you start companies in order to sell them to big companies, which means that you don't really develop a long-term product with a future. And that's just an example, but these are Republican issues. Romney talks so much about business. Well, business is becoming impossible in the United States, and it is also moving offshore.
Richard, as the American who actually lives in America at the moment...
well, until the election, we're all waiting to see if we're going to move to Canada.
And your new novel is called Canada.
Right.
But you've set your novels, through different decades of the post-war American experience, and I wonder whether you think that the sort of the fear of decline, the fear that everything is fragile, has always been there, or is it much more present now?
I think there is a kind of dynamism in America, in American life, which is sort of vertiginously sort of attuned to the size of the landmass that's always been there. It fosters American literature. It fosters the kind of entrepreneurial spirit. It's basically a kind of fear of failure that I think
geographical space and the sense of possibility are closely linked.
I think they are, and it just so happens now that no one wants to spend any money in the United States. That the notion of tax is a toxic notion, has been turned into a toxic notion. So what you see as a result of that is this not only decline, but you have a kind of fearfulness about the future, which has always been in the American spirit, but is actually quite stressing the negative now, it seems to me.
Well, I was struck by the fact that Ed had to change the title of his book in the United States, that you couldn't use the word decline. It had to be descent. And that indicates a tremendous fearfulness to me.
And an unwillingness to tell truth.
Yes.
What Richard was just saying about the energy and dynamism, and also Lionel's point, I think, is similar. I mean, it's very true. The country has this tremendous energy. Maybe you call it a fear of failure. Maybe it's a desire to succeed and build something new. When I go back to the United States, for example, to Washington, D.C. in particular, something that strikes me is the one place where there is energy and things look fresh and new and the bridges are actually shiny and it looks like Shanghai almost, is Washington, D.C.
You're quite right.
Now, that's a bit scary.
Where all the money is.
Absolutely.
15 of the 20 wealthiest counties in America are D.C., Virginia, Maryland. In other words, Greater Washington, D.C. And it is really the
15 or 20
defense industrial boom that's been going on since 9/11. I mean, and lobbying, of course. Lobbying has metastasized in the last decade.
Richard Ford raised the question of tax just now, and I mean, part of the interest of this conversation, I think, is there are so many unspoken parallels between Britain and America. Britain doesn't have the landmass. But in terms of taxation, Ed Luce, fewer and fewer people are taking more and more of the burden of tax in terms of sort of middle-class taxpayers. Meanwhile, as you show in your book, huge numbers of big corporations who used to pay the tax to fund the American infrastructure and American advance pay very, very little tax, either because they've gone offshore or because they've got clever accountants.
Yeah, I mean, GE, the New York Times did a brilliant piece last year that showed GE, which is one of America's 3 or 4 largest corporations, paid zero tax in 2010.
Even Google pays very little. Is it Google?
Well, Google, Amazon, I mean, any of the West Coast sort of iconic names you can care to think of, are headquartered in somewhere like Reno, Nevada, because they get zero tax. And if you're a small company, if you're an entrepreneur, you don't have you can't afford the lawyers and the accountants to work your way through this maze of loopholes. There is no lobby group for future entrepreneurs.
It's called the electoral system, the lobby group that should be who should be speaking for the people who are bearing the tax burden.
Lionel a moment ago was pointing out that you've got an absolutely enormous regulatory burden, which falls heaviest on the smaller businesses. And by small business, it's not just you got everything from the mom and pop shop up to somebody who wants to have a couple hundred employees in a small factory. You have a 75,000 page tax code, I think the number is.
You're right, yeah.
75,000 pages. That tells you a lot.
And under Nixon, it was 1,000 pages.
And compare it against the other OECD countries, the advanced industrial countries. I think you can say it's an order of magnitude. We're talking 10-fold, 20-fold difference between our regulatory code, the tax code plus the code of federal regulations, comparing that to most of the other industrial countries. Great if you've got a compliance department with 200 lawyers and 100 lobbyists like the very largest companies, and they do quite well under this system. But 50% over 50% of American jobs, and an even larger number of the new job creation, comes out of the smaller end, lower end, smaller businesses. And if you're just starting out, or even if you're quite well along in your way as an entrepreneur, how do you negotiate? You cannot afford to negotiate your way through that system.
And every time they try to simplify it, they simply add another 10,000 pages. Even eliminating loopholes creates more regulation.
Richard Ford.
It's sort of an electoral season commonplace to say that the burden of regulation falls most heavily on small businesses, and you've sort of come back from that by saying that small businesses don't have big law firms working for them or big compliance departments. But how is it in particular that regulation falls most heavily on small businesses rather than on large corporations? What are the particulars there?
Well, I mean, one example would be the IPO. If you're seeking to take a smaller business, which has done fairly well, it's grown a bit, if you're seeking to take it public, it's really hard and really expensive to do. I think there's some really interesting numbers in Ed's book.
This is Sarbanes-Oxley, which was passed in the wake of Enron and WorldCom in 2002. And otherwise known as the Full Employment Act for accountants and lawyers.
So while we've got this regulatory burden and going on in the States, we've also got a vast export of jobs. I think the number of manufacturing jobs that has been lost in America is not quite made up by the number of jobs in healthcare, a point you make. But what about, and then you've got a company like Foxconn in China manufacturing so many of the electronic gizmos that we use. Give us a sense of how big that is now compared to the American companies whose labels and names are on the products made by Foxconn.
Well, Foxconn in Shenzhen, it employs more people than Cisco, Google, Facebook, Amazon, and I think a couple of companies like Dell and HP, Hewlett-Packard put together, combined. So it's huge. I think it's probably worth stressing it's not just China, it's Mexico as well, that a lot of the sort of outsourcing is done to offshoring.
And again, this sounds quite familiar, I suspect, to quite a lot of British people who during the 1970s and 80s considered the argument that it didn't matter that we didn't make any cars anymore. It didn't matter that we didn't make computers. Or that would be done by somebody else, and our economy was somehow lighter and fresher and brighter and airier. And
definitely
more virtual
airier.
And airier.
And there was a great conceit that the knowledge economy, that we are the work of the brain, others will do the work of the hand. But if you look at the kinds of manufacturing jobs that are being outsourced, these are really high cognitive jobs. These are research and development jobs.
So you get, you think you're handing over a simple assembly plant, and in fact you're handing over to the very...
The PhDs go with it. They go with it.
A lot of the way in which the economy was supposed to resurge was based on premises having to do with re-education and retraining of people, and actually no money is being spent on re-education and retraining of people who have been laid off of their jobs in the Rust Belt or who have been laid off from their jobs elsewhere. So, I mean, if you're not going to pay, back to infrastructure again, if you're not going to pay for education, if you're not going to let the government spend money in these ways, then those people are going to go begging and they're not going to have a job.
Besides which, we're not talking about a kind of education that you get at a 2-year community college.
No.
We're talking about people with advanced degrees, which you're probably not going to get when you're 50, 55 years old. And India and China are training these people, young people, getting advanced degrees, and those are the people that are getting jobs, even in our own country.
Right. And Ed, you argue in your book that this produces a kind of crisis of American manhood or maleness.
Yeah, and there's this phrase, man session, to describe just how disproportionately, not just the current recession or the current downturn, but...
Oh, is it man session as in recession?
Yes,
I get it. Sorry.
Hitting men in particular.
Right.
But if you look at what's happened to middle-class incomes in the last 40 years, they're essentially flat. But they're the same in real terms today as they were in the early 1970s. But that masks the fact in the early 1970s, most households were single-earner households, and today most households are dual earner households. And what's happened in that is the man's wages have gone down by about 25-30%, and the woman's have either sort of come from nothing or gone up, and you get a net stagnant income picture, but with both working twice as hard. I mean, it's no surprise men are feeling like they're going backwards.
How do the people who would, and I'm basically talking about women in general, how do spokesmen for women's groups think about man session? Because it would seem to me that it might have another definition. It might have a definition of establishing some kind of equilibrium in the workplace.
I think there's a feeling that, women are more adaptable. There's less pride and dignity associated with work. They just sort of get on and do it. And men have expectations as to what kind of work they should be doing. And caring for people, home health aides, domestic assistant, whatever it is that are the new job horizons, food preparation, these very unglamorous jobs that we're seeing being created now. Women are just more prepared to do whatever it takes to make ends meet, and men, there's not necessarily an
sit around
economic
having midlife
explanation
crises.
for this.
That's what we do.
But
Midlife or early life or late life.
Those kinds of generalities, though, are the kinds of things that people like Lionel and I actually don't take for granted, and that we actually have to go to the particulars of individual lives to actually feel confident about. I mean, when you're talking about man session or the general malaise among the male population in America, there's something that just doesn't read right about that to me. Particularly when there's another whole point of view which has to do with female equilibrium, female gains in the workplace. You almost need a novel to tell. I'm sorry to be a proponent for Lionel's in my vocation, but you almost need a novel.
Trying to give me an idea for the next one.
Actually, I think Richard, something that came out in your book, the Canada book, which struck me very much when we think about education. The family in your book, I don't want to give a complete précis of the plot or give anything.
That's all right. You can go ahead and do that. Use up the rest of the show.
It's a family which has some real difficulties. Let's leave it at that. But the narrator comes through this as a pretty civilized person who ends up as a school teacher, and he can communicate in a really intelligent way. One of the things that strikes me about the family in the book, they have dinner together a lot, notwithstanding these really serious problems and tumult and turmoil they're in. And you can put a lot of money in education, but if you don't have that sort of framework, where the children come home and there's some sort of discussion, both these parents, despite their problems, they're talking to these two children
I think we could reveal the fact they turn out to be bank robbers. I think we're allowed to say that.
It is in the first line.
That was not an endorsement for bank robbery from the Republican side.
In other words, what you say is what you need is a stable home in which children can actually feel the ground under their feet to be rather steady.
And what's coming through here is the definition of stable, the definition of home can be pretty wide, can be pretty broad, because this is not the perfect home by any stretch of the imagination. But there's this basic degree of I don't know what the right word is. There's a degree of civilization in the way that parents are dealing with their kids here.
Let's talk a little bit more about the structure of American society at the moment, because it's clear that there is a group of people right at the top who've had an absolutely fabulous golden age time, and the cars and the houses and the yacht, everything is getting bigger. And there is a very badly stuck group of people at the bottom as well. And there are parts of American cities and towns which are simply falling to pieces. And again, you can say the same is true here as well. But in your novel, Canada, you have this very interesting example of a long way back, but a Canadian town which had been there for a purpose and is bit by bit just disappearing again.
Right. Well, I mean, that's just a function of agricultural economy, both in the prairies of Canada and the prairies of America. I mean, as small farms who don't actually own enough ground to make a living go out of existence and get consolidated into big farms, well, then those people in the little towns where they lived and that services them, they disappear. They go typically to the cities where they have a difficult time. I mean, that's part of the history of American literature, people doing that. It's part of it happens in Thomas Hardy, people doing the very same thing.
Exactly.
So, I mean, what happens what happens in North Central America is that it's kind of a semi-arid zone, and in order to make those parts of the world productive, you have to spend, I'm sorry to keep going back to this, money. You have to irrigate. You have to do the things to keep your farms supple and able to function.
The one area where there seems to be plenty of money to spend is American politics. You've got a great quote from way back, I think, in your book, Ed, about what matters in American politics.
The two most important, it's the three most important things for American politics are money, and I forget what the third is, and that comes from Mark Hanna, who invented the modern campaign essentially in 1898. This is going to be a $3 billion election. Each of the candidates plus their super PAC allies will spend about $1 billion. And to give you an idea of how much hyperinflation that involves, George Bush in 2000 shattered all records when he spent $100 million.
Wow. So much for blind justice in America, because it was the Supreme Court of the United States that allowed these super PACs to function in the way that they are.
Tom, do you worry about the effect on American politics of all this money? Because, I mean, it's clear that both Romney but also Obama spent a lot of time over the last 6 months with small groups of very, very wealthy people just raising more and more and more and more money to spend on attack ads in a relatively small number of states. And that must affect how he approaches things like bank regulation.
It's a huge country, and the challenge when you run a national campaign is, even when it narrows down to 10 or 11, actually this morning it's 12 or 13 very close states, taking those states as an aggregate, it's still a huge piece of geography, a lot of separate media markets. Speaking in London on media, you reach most of the people in the United Kingdom, and a lot of people well beyond the United Kingdom. Speaking in Cincinnati, Ohio, you reach Cincinnati, you don't even reach Columbus, Cleveland, and Dayton. The cost is almost inevitably going to be very high in running a national campaign. There are serious questions about exactly how you should calibrate the regulatory framework, exactly how the regulator should apply those rules, and of course, we have an independent judiciary which has to apply the statutes.
But doesn't money in the end always talk? In other words, if people like President Obama or indeed Governor Romney need to get their money from hedge fund managers, small groups of bankers, big oil, etc., that then corrupts the American, the heart of power.
It's sort of interesting. There's almost a paradox in the scale of campaign fundraising in these U.S. elections. If you have a situation where you need, let's just pick a number, $1 million, and you get 1,000 contributors to bring that together for you, you could conceivably actually take some direction from a big piece of your donor base, 1,000 people. These presidential campaigns are having fundraisers across the course of several years, which will bring in hundreds of thousands of people. I think the reality is the actual influence, if you think that by giving even a pretty hefty contribution, if you think you're going to walk in the door in the White House and have a chat even with a high-level advisor, never mind with the boss.
You're saying there's too many of you. It's not going to happen. The queue's too long.
The queue's going to go...
But you think Sheldon Adelson isn't going to get an audience with the President Romney? This is the Las Vegas billionaire who's so far spent $70 million on Romney's campaign. He's not going to get an audience?
The people at the top are definitely going to get an audience. In fact, that's what you're saying. That despite the illusion of great popular support that, for example, originally elected Obama, it's really only the people with very fat checkbooks and the corporations that are going to get into the White House.
And Ed Luce, we've been talking about Romney there, but you make the point that the kind of people that Obama has been talking to are the CEOs of vast corporations who have the very same people who have exported the jobs and the investment out of America.
I mean, traditionally there's been, I mean, as Tom will back me up here, there's been, defense and energy back the Republicans, and entertainment and IT go for the Democrats, and Wall Street is the swing vote. And
they
Wall
give
Street,
money to both parties.
They give money to both, but in 2008 they did heavily go for Obama, and in 2012 they're heavily going for Romney. I mean that's a very clear.
John Voight and Bo Derek go for our side, but they're entertainers.
There are the occasional Hollywood
That's just
actor.
two, though, I think.
Yeah, it's just two.
I'm especially dismayed not just about the money, but about Ed brings this up also, the perpetual campaign.
Right.
The campaign is never over. I mean, I was struck by the fact that in reporting on Obama's subpar performance in the first debate, the media despaired that he was distracted so consistently in his training for this debate from having to do his job.
So I just want to raise a sort of structural question. To what extent are the midterm elections a real problem in American politics? In that, just 2 years into any presidency, the American people get a chance for second thought, saying, actually, no, we made a mistake, we don't like them anyway, and stop whoever is president, Republican or Democrat, doing very much by pushing Congress the other way.
I agree. I mean, I think that this is a constitutional problem, that having congressmen elected every 2 years is now a catastrophe.
But it also represents a deep skepticism in the American society about government, about having congressmen hold their jobs too long, and I think it responds to something that is it is constitutional. It's almost natively American. Americans are basically not very interested in government at all, irrespective of Democrats or Republicans. They only seem to be interested because of this perpetuation of the election cycle. But why are congressmen elected every 2 years, and what effect it has on the government? I think it responds to skepticism about government, and it is only really, I think, because the parties have been at loggerheads ideologically, and the level of incivility in the conversation about government, that it seems problematical now. I don't think it's really problematical myself.
And yet here we have an American system in perpetual campaigning mode. Very few parts of the system look long ahead, and now America is head-to-head with China. Whatever you think of the Chinese system, these are guys in the Politburo looking 50 years ahead. They're engineers. It feels like a bit of an unequal struggle.
Well, you're right, because it causes people to be concentrated in the government upon retaining their place in government, rather than doing what they were sent to Washington to do, which is to look out for the interests of their constituencies.
And I think it's important to stress that gridlock is by design.
Yeah.
I mean, it is to prevent
it's checks and balances.
To prevent another George III.
I talked right at the beginning about the founding fathers, and I suppose the ideology, the basic thinking of America, Republican or Democrat these days, is very much about free trade and open borders and open markets. But Ed, you make the point that very much like Britain, when Britain became a stronger and stronger industrial power, or Germany when that happened, America started off with tariff boundaries and protectionism and special government help, just like China today.
Indeed, and Alexander Hamilton, who was really the founding father, the economic founding father, set up something called the American system, which was essentially a high tariff wall to protect incipient American manufacturers, but and also, fascinatingly, and a very clear echo of China today with all the controversy over intellectual property theft, he sent out spies, to
nick ideas from Britain,
to take art rights apprentices, and Britain responded by making it a capital offence for highly skilled artisans to leave the country. And Hamilton still succeeded in getting them over, and then they were treated as heroes in America. So you have to pull yourself up by your bootstraps when you're an industrializing country. This is what America did, and remarkably, it kept really high tariff barriers right up until the Second World War.
And yet now people go to America to get their PhDs and then go straight back again to earn salaries outside America.
There's quite a lot of movement in America, though, to try to keep these people, once they get their degrees very expensively, to stay in the country to practice their professions and vocations.
The immigration system does not encourage
No,
them
the
to
immigration
stay.
system does
and
not.
And that is the biggest barrier. And it would be the easiest thing to solve. There's way too much concentration on the lower level, the illegal immigration in the United States politically, and there's not nearly, there's no concentration at the top. We are putting enormous efforts into keeping out people who obey the rules, who have PhDs.
Tom,
I can only amplify and associate myself with Lionel's observation. It's a disaster if you set up disincentives for these people who create ideas, create businesses from coming and settling in the country. And if you've got people who've done PhDs and advanced sciences in areas of engineering, you've got to make it an easy process for them to stay and do their thing.
The average amount of time it takes to get a green card in the United States is 10 years.
Tom, do you recognise also a sense of naivety, perhaps, in America's overarching enthusiasm for open everything at a time when other countries are behaving rather differently?
Well, I think it's important to look industry by industry and see what the other countries are doing and see what the strategy behind their actions is. If you have a very powerful market actor, I think we're talking about China in particular, and it has decided that there is something, a particular field, let's take aviation, aerospace engineering, and they've decided they want to overtake their competitors, which mainly mean Europe and the United States. And if they're doing things which are outside the international trade framework, if they're violating the rules, if they're engaging in dumping, protectionism, and so on, we have to be vigorous.
As Obama has been with solar panels recently.
And tires and
tires, right?
Yeah,
very recently.
I'd like to sort of
Too late.
There, I'd like to conclude by talking about is what appears from an outsider's view to be the sort of extreme polarization of American politics now. Having come back from there, I mean, the level of anger and the extremism of a lot of the language that's used, I don't know if that's new or not, and I wonder to what extent Democrats and Republicans now live in different Americas and don't really communicate with each other, don't bump into each other, watch different TV stations, listen to different radio stations, indeed inhabit slightly different parts of the country geographically.
I would just jump in and go back to the point we were making about midterm elections and the importance of the 2-year cycle.
Yeah.
2004, 1994, a really powerful signal came from the electorate to the Clinton administration. Basically, Republicans took over the House for the first time in a very long time, half a century, and that communicated to the administration, changed things. And the administration did, and it was an enormously productive period. I'm not sure the 2010 election, though the signal was loud and clear, was actually received by the intended recipient, President Obama and his administration. If polarization has increased since then, one of the reasons well may be that despite the pretty clear message from that signaling process, that 2-year cycle of congressional elections, the administration just kind of dug its heels in and continued doing the same thing.
I think, I'm sorry.
I wanted
Lionel.
to go back to what you asked about, because I had an experience this summer that did really take me aback. I went to a picnic sponsored by a friend of mine in Connecticut. And it was about, 75 people. And everyone agreed with everyone. And I had a conversation or two in which I indicated that I supported the Conservative Party in the UK. That was, of course, the wrong word. They didn't know anything about UK politics. And I made myself a pariah. I mean, that was an upsetting experience because this was typical. It is a complete political apartheid. And if you go to a party in the New York area, you know they're all going to be Democrats. And if you open your mouth and say something that seems faintly Republican, or even mildly pleasant about the other side, you shock everyone, and they will physically pull away from you.
And vice versa, probably. Richard, do you recognise this?
But I was just going to say, in response to your earlier question, I don't think, and I know what Lionel says is exactly right in social settings. You don't talk about politics except with people whom you agree with. But I think as regards to the more sort of thoroughgoing part of your questions, are Americans, Republicans and Democrats living separate lives? I don't think so. I don't think so at all. I think Americans are living side by side with people who don't agree with them. They just don't talk about it. And I think there are reasons that are I won't say endemic in the culture, but I think that there are reasons that have to do with, I'm sorry to say, the media, and how the media actually negotiates public issues that make it very difficult.
Too aggressively. Ed, a last thought from you.
There's a great book called The Big Sort by Bill Bishop, which shows how over time like-minded Democrats, like-minded Republicans, and people at much more detailed features have started to move into to live together, and in other words, separate from each other in separate zip codes, postal codes. And to the extent where, when Carter was elected, I don't want to go into too much detail.
We won't go into Carter,
but there is a sort going on at the ground level. It's not just in Washington. There's a polarization going on in society.
Americans, Democrat and Republican, are always welcome to come together, of course, in central London. Thank you to all my guests. Thomas Grant, Chair of Republicans Abroad UK. Lionel Shriver's next book, Big Brother, is out in the spring and will be set in America's Midwest. Richard Ford's latest novel, Canada, and Edward Luce's Time to Start Thinking, America and the Spectre of Decline, are both out now. Next week, Year Zero, when modernism arrived in literature, art and music, 1922, with Kevin Jackson, Ali Smith, Julian Anderson and Will Gompertz. But for now, thank you and goodbye.
Preparedness. America led in all 19 in the early 1990s. It now leads in only 4 of those 19. And so that's one of the reasons why these people at the National Defense University are so panicked about America's economic strength, because the waning manufacturing strength undermines its military punch.
Richard Ford.
I was just going to chime in and say that notion about, sort of isolating ourselves to some extent is actually not so surprising, because that's kind of an old-style Republican attitude, to spend money on education, to spend money on infrastructure. That doesn't sound Republican now. It sounds... but it would have sounded Republican 25 years ago, I think. I think we were talking about Eisenhower. Before Eisenhower was made, invested a whole lot of money in infrastructure. It's just neoconservatism, and it's the advent of the Tea Party, really, which has made spending anathema so that you can't do that. But in terms, I'm not a Republican.
Of rising, bright military guys who've been asked about the strategic threat to America.
Yes, and what really struck me about their attitude, the military is, a bastion of republicanism, is that they completely depart from the Republican Party orthodoxy by saying that the first thing we must do is withdraw from the world, is bring down our presence in the world, because military strength is based on economic strength. And they conduct these simulations of what the world will look like 5-10 years from now.
So these are Pentagon people, these are rising sort of Air Force, Naval, Army
These are
guys.
bright mid-career people who are going to be at the top 5-10 years from now, and they're getting sort of cognitive training.
And they're saying, get out of Europe, get out of the Middle East, let China have the China Sea, because they want to slash that spending and spend it on
education, infrastructure.
Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello. Well, tomorrow President Obama, in a far tighter race than he expected, has his second debating face-off with a resurgent Mitt Romney. Both men talk a lot about the American dream and in a rather cloudy way about the founding fathers, but in this election there's been surprisingly little serious analysis of America's economic decline in the face of China, of the pinched reality for middle-class voters, of the second-rate education system and so on. So today we are going to be looking at the state of this union with the Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist Richard Ford, the novelist and commentator Lionel Shriver, the chairman of Republicans Abroad in the UK Thomas Grant, and the FT's former Washington bureau chief, Ed Luce, whose analysis of US decline he's called Time to Start Thinking, America and the Spectre of Decline. Ed, you begin this book in a rather surprising place, perhaps, at the National Defense University outside Washington, where you have a group of...
something like 3/4 go to the top 10%. All of them are defended in the name of the poor. But dispersed to the rich. It is quite striking how true this is of each anti-poverty program, barring the total anti-poverty ones like food stamps. Clearly, Bill Gates isn't getting food stamps. And so the public spending argument, as we face this prolonged era of fiscal austerity, is about, as you know, with Romney's 47% comment, 47% of America doesn't pay federal income tax. These are the takers. As opposed to the makers, according to that perspective.
But one of the crucial arguments that you make in this book is that the makers, in the sense of manufacturing in particular, has been exported in a very, very dramatic way, not just to China, but around the world. America doesn't make nearly as much as it used to.
No, and to get back to the Pentagon, they had a report of the 19 most critical industries for America's defense industrial, rebuilding the domestic economy, which is the sinew, the foundation of military power.
There is a huge argument, as you know, going on about American declinism. Is it real? Is it overstated? Are Americans taking it seriously enough? Because, there are lots of people who would argue actually America remains an extraordinarily inventive, optimistic, mobile, relatively well-educated society.
Each of those is true, but less true than it used to be. Take mobile, for example. Your chances of moving up an income bracket, class mobility, are lower in the United States, not only than in Canada, Germany, but even than in Britain nowadays, which is the least mobile of the developed economies.
And you've got an astonishing statistic, I think, about the proportion of the extra money, the stimulus that Obama pushed in over the last 4 years, which has gone to the people at the very top.
Yes, and in fact, this is true of all sort of anti-poverty programs, is basically the rich get most of it. If you look at the mortgage subsidy,